And joining us now to discuss the upcoming NATO summit and the challenges faced by the member states of the alliance is Jon Sweet, retired military intelligence officer. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hey, thanks for having me back on the show today.
So quite recently a report has surfaced suggesting that NATO's military capabilities may actually need to be increased significantly in order to deter a potential Russian aggression and to defend against it. Why do you think this report is actually emerging now, and could it have any bearing on the way the decisions will be taken during the summit and the way the deliberations of the people present there will take place? In short, do you think that there is a risk NATO might be under-equipped to deal with the potential aggression from Russia?
So from a conventional perspective, a land force is an invasion with armor, infantry. NATO's in a good position. I think the concern that you're talking about was in reference to whether or not NATO had adequate air defense to deal with the type of strikes, hypersonic missile strikes, and the potential for nuclear weapon strikes into NATO territory. I think that's where the concern is, and whether or not they have the right air defense weapons to address that concern.
So now do you think that initiatives such as the European Sky Shield initiative, for example, would be the preferable solution to that? The Sky Shield initiative, after all, encompasses various levels of air defense, from medium to very long range, and would encompass, for example, the joint purchase of the Arrow 3 system.
Sure. Look, all the systems that are being discussed, when they're incorporated together and layered and synchronized, provide adequate air defense support against those type of systems. But that's only part of the solution. Interdicting missiles or interdicting aircraft that are coming at you is part of it. But if you don't defeat the weapon system itself, that weapon system is being fired from a bomber, a Tu-95 bomber, or that weapon system is being launched from a position within Russia, you're only satisfying part of the requirement. If you don't beat the weapon system, it's going to fire at you again the next day and the next. So that air defense shield has to incorporate both defensive measures and then active defensive measures. But I think NATO's in a good position to address all those.
Speaking of which, there is a more immediate concern. Ukraine needs those air defenses pretty much right now, and the problem is still that not all countries apparently are prepared to deliver them. A German system, the Patriot system that was in Germany, will now be delivered to Ukraine, which is of course good news, but it will not be sufficient to address all the threats present there. And you've mentioned the question also of the potential aggressor using aircraft to launch missiles at you. This is precisely why Ukraine wants to have long-range capabilities, not limited to specific sites, but essentially they want to be allowed to strike them at their discretion, including Russian airfields, which apparently they cannot do right now. Why are these decisions not taken yet? I mean, one would assume that it would have been clear by now that this is a time of the essence kind of situation.
That's a great question. Why aren't they being pursued? Look, Ukraine wants to pursue them, and organically they can with the Neptune missile that they have developed. That has a range upwards to 750 to 1,000 kilometers, so they can reach Ingalls Air Base, which is where the T-95 or T-90, the Tu-95 bombers are being launched from. But the restrictions that are being placed upon Ukraine, it comes in the form of a action, reaction, counteraction. The action being Russia is doing something. The reaction is that Ukraine provides an action and Russia does something to react to that. And in this case, the reaction was with the introduction of ATACMS striking targets within Russia. They were told later, Ukraine, that they couldn't fire beyond 100 kilometers and they couldn't strike airfields beyond 100 kilometers. And that's exactly the message that Russia understood, and Russia just simply moved their systems back beyond that 100 kilometers. In all likelihood, the attack on Kyiv today came from a Tu-95, and it was a KH-101 air-launched cruise missile that struck the city. So it's the reaction and not going after the target where the target is, rather waiting for it to come to you. Again, there's the defensive aspect, and then there's the proactive aspect, and we're not doing the two together.
So, do you believe that any sort of major decisions might be taken? We're already hearing that many countries are not ready yet to commit to any sort of definite timetable for Ukraine joining NATO, which is bad news because there are also signals from the political arena, so to say, that should we actually see a change in the White House, the perspective of joining NATO for Ukraine might be delayed even further, perhaps indefinitely. Do you think that this might actually be the sort of last chance for taking bold decisions before the political reality may set in and make it much more difficult in the near future?
This could very well be a last best chance time to put together an initiative for Ukraine. I think when we leave the NATO conference, one of the strongest messages that can be provided both to Ukraine and to Russia is that that Ukraine is going to be brought into the NATO fold, into the NATO membership, and not necessarily putting a timeline out there because Russia will react to the timeline, but rather saying that we are setting the conditions to bring them in. One, militarily, the interaction that you spoke of earlier between NATO and Ukraine, but then the other pieces, the other conditions that come with NATO membership. And I think that needs to be put out there. Russia needs to hear that the end state for Ukraine at the conclusion of the war is that they will be brought into the fold. That they have to hear that.
Now, you've mentioned Russia reacting to certain events. Now, there have been suggestions from certain politicians, diplomats, that we should be less worried about what Russia is going to do because it often says we're going to do something if there is a move that we consider escalatory. The move itself happens, Russia does nothing, or simply lashes out against civilians, which it does anyway, arguably. So it's impossible to actually say that this is a response on the escalatory scale. So this is what happens. Right? And there are politicians which suggest, okay, we should break away with this, instead make them worry about what we're going to do. Do you think this sort of boldness can still be found among the leaders of countries which form the alliance today?
I do. And it's there. It can be there. The current set of leaders are capable of making those type of decisions. But Russia needs to understand is they're trying to lay the foundation, to set the rules, to tell the West what's going to happen and what they're going to do if the West responds. The strongest voice from the West so far has come from the French president, who reminded Russia several months ago that you're not the only country that has nuclear weapons. And Russia needs to be reminded of that very fact, is that they're not the only nuclear game in town. And they also need to be reminded that going after civilian targets. And look, today's escalation was another type of weapon system, in this case, the KH-101, that has the ability to evade air defense systems. It also has the ability to fly very low. We call it Napa to Earth, using terrain to mask its movement. It's another escalation, and it's designed, as you saw today in Kyiv, in this case, it was used to target civilian targets, specifically hospitals. The Children's Hospital is one, but there are two other hospitals that were struck. And Russia needs to be told what the consequences are. They need to put that red line down. They've been very hesitant today to put a red line down. But there has to be something that says, intentionally targeting civilians and going after hospitals is not going to bring this to the negotiation table. If anything, it's going to make us want to support Ukraine more.
Aren't you worried that in the end it might as well end up as it did already, that at some point Western leaders are going to say, oh look, we should have listened to the Baltics more, we should have listened to Poland more, but then not really committing to doing anything apart from expressing this sort of regret? I mean, we're hearing Mr. Sikorski or Mr. Landsbergis basically making it clear, look, you have an aggressor state which is killing civilians, which is committing war crimes. It might get worse in the future if we don't stop them in Ukraine, but some Western countries are still saying, well, of course, yes, but there are reasons why we're not really doing anything more.
I would love to know what those reasons are. What we're dealing with right now, particularly in the West, and we just saw it in England, we saw it in France, are elections, and we're seeing those elections coming up in the United States also. So there is some hesitancy to do certain actions that may or may not affect the electorate or affect the outcome of what's going on the ground. And to me, that's what's most frustrating, is here we are dealing with a country that's fighting for its very existence and its survival. and we're more worried about the election process. The election process will work itself out if we do the right things, which is to provide Ukraine the weapons and the technology they need to win the war, to defeat Russia in Ukraine and to push them out of the country. Then everything else will take care of itself. But until we're able to actually make that decision and stop with the restrictions and trying to drive the train from Washington, D.C. or Brussels, we have to enable Ukraine to win. And right now, we're not enabling them to win. We're prolonging it. We're prolonging the fight, in my opinion, by giving them more defensive capability. And that's great, but there has to be some offensive there somewhere. They have to be able to interdict, and they have to be able to strike weapon systems that are targeting them, or this will go on. This will be that forever war that President Biden warned us about during his election.
So overall, there needs to be a bolder approach. Perhaps the leaders gathering at the summit will finally come to some sort of understanding, especially given the absolutely shocking and horrifying events taking place in Kiev earlier today. Jon Sweet was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thanks for having me back on.